They called her dead weight, a whisper that followed Sergeant Anya Sharma like the fine, pervasive dust of Kandahar. It was a verdict passed in the fleeting glances of men who measured worth in muscle mass and swagger, and in both, she was found wanting. Her arrival at Forward Operating Base Sentinel was an anomaly, an administrative error made flesh. The soldiers of Scimitar Company saw a woman with a quiet, unassuming build, eyes that seemed to absorb light without reflecting it, and a file so heavily redacted it was more black ink than text. They saw a problem, a liability. They didn't see the truth. That truth, however, was about to be revealed under the clarifying, brutal light of enemy fire, and by the time the smoke cleared, no one would ever call her dead weight again. ####1. Arrival and assessment. The C-130's ramp lowered with a hydraulic groan, vomiting a wave of superheated air into the cabin. Sergeant Anya Sharma descended into the furnace of Forward Operating Base Sentinel, her boots crunching on the gravel-strewn tarmac. The sun was a merciless hammer in a bleached white sky, and the air tasted of grit, diesel, and something metallic like old blood. Around her, soldiers moved with the weary, ingrained efficiency of men long accustomed to this hostile corner of the world. They were broad-shouldered and sun-scorched, their M4S held with a casual intimacy. Sharma, by contrast, seemed almost out of place. She was lean where they were bulky, her movements economical where theirs were expansive. She carried her duffel in one hand and her rifle in the other, her posture a perfect, disciplined line from head to heel. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe, functional knot, and her face, though beaded with sweat, remained a mask of placid neutrality. She was an island of stillness in a sea of restless motion. Private First Class Evans, barely 20 and still trying to grow a convincing mustache, nudged his squad mate, Corporal Diaz. "Get a load of the new transfer," he muttered, his voice a low drawl. "Command must be scraping the bottom of the barrel." Diaz grunted, his eyes sweeping over Sharma in a quick, dismissive appraisal. "Looks like she'd get blown over by the rotor wash from a Black Hawk. They stick her with us. Logistics, I heard. Pushing pencils. Still another mouth to feed, another body to protect. Deadweight." The term, once spoken, took root. It spread through the ranks on the dry wind, a contagion of assumption. Deadweight. It clung to her as she was directed toward the administrative tent, a shadow cast not by the sun, but by prejudice. Sharma heard it, of course. She heard everything. Her senses were honed to a razor's edge, capable of picking out the snap of a twig over the roar of a generator, or the subtle shift in a man's breathing that betrayed a lie. The whispers were just another data point in a threat assessment that was already running constantly in the back of her mind. She cataloged the base's layout, the placement of the HESCO barriers, the fields of fire from the guard towers, the predictable patrol routes of the perimeter guards. She noted the slight sag in the concertina wire on the western fence line, the blind spot behind the fuel depot. She saw the overconfident posture of the men, the subtle fatigue that dulled their reflexes. They saw a liability. She saw vulnerabilities everywhere. Her expression didn't change. She simply walked on, her steps even and measured, absorbing the details of her new cage, her new hunting ground. The silence she projected was mistaken for fear, her stillness for weakness. It was a miscalculation they would all come to appreciate, and one that some of them would not survive. ####2. The Colonel's dismissal. Colonel Madsen's office was the nerve center of FOB Sentinel, an air-conditioned oasis of order amidst the sprawling chaos of the base. Maps lined one wall, bristling with pins and overlays. A bank of monitors on another displayed grainy drone feeds and encrypted communications traffic. Madsen himself was a man carved from the same hard rock as the surrounding mountains, square-jawed, with eyes the color of faded slate and a demeanor that tolerated no ambiguity. He looked at Sergeant Sharma, who stood at perfect parade rest before his desk, and his gaze was one of frank, undisguised skepticism. "Sergeant Sharma," he began, his voice a low rumble that matched the hum of the servers. He tapped a finger on the physical copy of her file. The document was a study in frustration. Page after page was dominated by thick black bars of redaction. Her service record was a ghost. No commendations, no disciplinary actions, no previous unit assignments. Just a name, a rank, and a transfer order from a high-level command he couldn't question. "Your file is sparse," he said, the word dripping with condescension. "It tells me nothing." And in my experience, files that tell you nothing are hiding one of two things: a history of spectacular failure or a politically motivated assignment. Given your physical stature, I'm leaning toward the latter. He gestured vaguely at her lean frame, a clear dismissal of her physical capabilities in his infantry-centric world. Sharma remained silent. Her eyes were fixed on a point on the wall, just over his shoulder. Her breathing was steady, her pulse a slow, metronomic beat. She had faced men far more intimidating than this desk-bound colonel. She had looked into the eyes of true monsters, and she had not flinched. His petty attempt at intimidation was like a child throwing pebbles at a fortress wall. "I run a tight ship here, Sergeant," Madsen continued, leaning forward. "Every soldier on this FOB has a purpose. Every rifle contributes to our defense. We are surrounded by an enemy that is patient, clever, and utterly ruthless. We carry no passengers. We have no room for dead weight." He let the term hang in the air, a deliberate, pointed insult. Still, Sharma did not react. There was no flicker of anger, no defensive stiffening of her posture. She simply waited. Her silence seemed to unnerve him more than any argument would have. He had expected a protest, an excuse, a plea. He got nothing but calm, unwavering discipline. He sighed, leaning back in his chair with a huff of exasperation. "You're assigned to supply. Master Sergeant Thorne will be your supervisor. Your job is to count inventory, sign out gear, and stay out of the way of the real soldiers. Is that understood?" "Crystal, sir," Sharma said. Her voice was clear and even, devoid of any emotion. It was the first time she had spoken, and the sheer neutrality of it seemed to take him aback. "Dismissed," he grunted, already turning his attention back to his monitors, having already written her off as an inconsequential annoyance. Sharma executed a crisp about-face and walked out of the office. The cool air of the command post washed over her for a moment before she stepped back into the oppressive heat. She had her assignment. Stay out of the way. It was, she reflected, a perfect position. No one ever watched the woman counting blankets and bootlaces. From the shadows of the supply depot, you could see everything. And Anya Sharma was very, very good at seeing. ####3. A study in silence and steel. The supply depot was a vast, cavernous tent smelling of canvas, gun oil, and cardboard. It was a forgotten kingdom of stacked crates and metal shelving, a place where soldiers only came when they needed something. For Sergeant Sharma, it became a sanctuary and an observation post. Master Sergeant Thorne, a grizzled veteran with a face like a roadmap of every conflict since the Cold War, gave her a cursory tour and a stack of inventory manifests. He, too, had heard the rumors. He didn't voice them, but his weary eyes held the same skepticism as the colonel's. "Just keep the numbers straight, Sharma," he'd said, before retreating to his small, cluttered office to wrestle with requisitions paperwork. Sharma took to her task with a meticulous, almost reverent focus. She didn't just count items, she assessed them. She checked the seals on medical kits, the tension on tourniquets, the expiration dates on MREs. Her movements were a study in efficiency, each action precise and purposeful. But her mind was elsewhere. The depot was centrally located, offering clear lines of sight to the motor pool, the barracks, the mess hall, and, most importantly, the perimeter defenses. She learned the rhythms of the base. She knew which guard tower was manned by the most vigilant soldiers and which was manned by the ones who spent their shifts scrolling through pictures on their phones. She knew that the morning patrol always left 3 minutes late and that the evening patrol consistently took a shortcut back to the wire, creating a predictable pattern. She observed the dust devils that whipped across the barren landscape outside the walls, noting how they shifted with the wind, how they could provide momentary cover for a skilled infiltrator. Her hands, however, were busy with the tools of war. One afternoon, a young sniper from a recon team came in to exchange his rifle scope, complaining it wouldn't hold zero. Sharma took the high-powered optic into her hands. The soldier expected her to just log it and hand him a new one. Instead, he watched, mesmerized, as she produced a small, specialized toolkit from her pocket. Her fingers, deft and sure, disassembled the scope's mounting rings. "The torque is uneven," she stated, not looking at him. Her voice was quiet, factual. "The front screw is 5 inch-pounds looser than the rear, under the recoil of a 338 Lapua that creates a microscopic harmonic vibration. It'll throw your shot off by 6 inches at 800 meters. More if there's a crosswind." She methodically cleaned the threads, applied a minuscule amount of thread locker, and remounted the scope, using a torque wrench to tighten the screws to the exact, precise specification. She checked the reticle alignment, her eye pressed to the lens. The entire process took less than 5 minutes. She handed it back to him. "It will hold zero now," she said. The sniper, a cocky sergeant who had never given her a second glance, was speechless. He took the rifle, the weight of it suddenly feeling different, more reliable. He looked from the perfectly calibrated scope to her impassive face. "How did you?" he started to ask. "I read the manual," she replied without a hint of irony, and turned back to her inventory sheets. Master Sergeant Thorne had watched the entire exchange from his office doorway. He'd been in the Army for 30 years. He knew the difference between a clerk following instructions and someone with an innate, muscle-deep understanding of a weapon system. A clerk doesn't carry a precision torque wrench in their pocket. A clerk doesn't talk about harmonic vibrations. He looked at Sharma, truly looked at her for the first time, and the skepticism in his eyes was replaced by a flicker of profound curiosity. The whispers called her dead weight, but Thorne was beginning to suspect she was anything but. He was looking at a predator pretending to be prey, and he had no idea why. ###4. The world explodes. The day it happened began like any other. The sun rose, beating down on FOB Sentinel with its familiar, oppressive weight. The morning was a dull routine of radio checks, engine maintenance, and the constant, low-grade hum of generators. Sergeant Sharma was in the supply tent, conducting a silent, one-woman war against administrative chaos. She was cross-referencing ammunition lot numbers when the distant, familiar crump of an explosion echoed across the valley. It wasn't the controlled blast of a Yodi range. This was sharper, angrier. Before the sound had fully faded, a second, thunderous detonation followed, much closer this time. The ground trembled. Shouts erupted across the base. The placid rhythm of the morning was shattered. Sharma didn't flinch. She set down her clipboard, her head cocked, listening. She processed the sounds with the cold analysis of a machine. An IED, likely a command-detonated daisy chain, to initiate. The second blast was an RPG, lead vehicle and tail vehicle of a convoy, a classic box-in ambush. The target would be the supply convoy, codenamed Packhorse 4, which she knew was due back within the hour. The base's siren began its piercing, rising wail. The radio on Thorne's desk crackled to life, a frantic cacophony of panicked voices. "Contact! Contact! Ambush 2 clicks west of the gate. Packhorse 4 is boxed in. Heavy machine gun fire from the ridge line. I'm hit. Medic!" Through the open flap of the tent, Sharma could see soldiers scrambling, grabbing armor and rifles, their faces etched with a mixture of adrenaline and fear. The Quick Reaction Force, QRF, was mustering near the motor pool, but their efforts were immediately hampered by a new threat. A high-pitched whistle sliced through the air, followed by the deafening crack of a mortar round impacting just inside the perimeter fence. Then another and another. The enemy was walking the mortars in a disciplined, systematic barrage designed to suppress any response from a base. They were pinning the QRF down, preventing them from reinforcing the trapped convoy. Colonel Madsen's voice, tight with strain, cut through the chatter on the radio. "All stations, maintain fire discipline. TOC, give me eyes on that ridge. Where's the mortar team? Panic is a virus. Sharma could feel it spreading through the base, a palpable wave of fear and confusion. The plan, the one they drilled and rehearsed, was falling apart under the pressure of a well-executed, complex attack. The soldiers in the convoy were being slaughtered. The soldiers on the base were pinned and helpless. In the midst of the escalating chaos, Sharma was an oasis of perfect calm. Her heart rate remained steady. Her breathing was deep and even. For her, this was not chaos. It was a problem, a tactical equation with a set of variables: enemy positions, friendly assets, terrain, and timing. While others saw mayhem, she saw a sequence of events. While they felt fear, she felt a cold, familiar clarity. She had watched the terrain west of the base for weeks. She knew the ridge line they were talking about, but she also knew something else. About 500 meters north of the ambush site, there was a small, insignificant-looking rocky outcrop. It was lower than the main ridge, easily overlooked, but it offered a perfect, oblique angle of fire into the flank of the enemy's position. It was an ideal sniper's nest. And as the mortar rounds continued to fall, sowing confusion and terror, she knew with absolute certainty that the enemy's command and control element, the spotter directing the mortars, the leader coordinating the attack, would be there. They would feel safe there, unseen, untouchable. They were wrong. While the FOB scrambled and the men of Scimitar Company braced for impact, Anya Sharma began to move. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't even hurrying. She was simply executing a solution. #5. Intervention by a ghost. Sharma didn't ask for permission. In a situation collapsing this quickly, asking for permission was a form of suicide. She moved from the supply tent to the armory with a fluid, economical grace that belied the urgency of the moment. The armorer, a young corporal, was huddled behind a counter, his eyes wide as another mortar shell exploded near the mess hall. He didn't even notice her slip past him into the secured cage. Her destination was a specific hard case in the back, one she had inspected just days before. Inside lay an M110 semi-automatic sniper system. It wasn't the most powerful rifle in the armory, but it was reliable, accurate, and offered a quick follow-up shot. She had personally verified its zero, cleaned its action, and confirmed the quality of the glass in its Leupold scope. She slung the rifle over her back and grabbed 4 magazines of 762mm match-grade ammunition, stuffing them into the cargo pockets of her trousers. She was equipped in under 30 seconds. Her exit was as ghost-like as her entrance. Instead of heading for the main gate and the chaotic QRF staging area, she moved toward the back of the base, toward the sagging concertina wire she had noted weeks ago. The mortar impacts provided perfect cover. As the ground shook from an explosion 100 meters away, she used the noise and the cloud of dust to slip through a maintenance hatch in the perimeter wall. She was outside the wire, alone. The world outside the FOB was a maelstrom of sound and fury. The chatter of machine guns, the crack of rifles, and the sickening thud of rounds impacting the trapped convoy's vehicles filled the air. Sharma ignored it all. She ran low to the ground, her body a tight, compact shape that offered a minimal target. She didn't run in a straight line, but moved in a broken, unpredictable rhythm, sprinting from one piece of cover to the next. A wadi, a cluster of rocks, a slight depression in the earth. Her path was not direct. It was calculated, using the terrain to mask her approach to the rocky outcrop. She reached its base, her breathing barely elevated. The climb was short but steep. She moved up the rocks like a lizard, finding handholds and footholds with an instinctual ease, her rifle secure on her back. She reached the top and crawled the last few feet on her belly, inching her way to a vantage point between 2 weathered boulders. She slowly raised her head. The scene was laid out before her like a tactical diagram. Below her and to her left was the ambush kill zone, the burning husks of the convoy vehicles. She could see the muzzle flashes of the enemy fighters arrayed along the main ridge. And directly in front of her, just as she had predicted, was the enemy's command element. 4 men. One was on a radio, his head tilted as he spoke. Another was looking through a pair of powerful binoculars, directing the mortar fire. A third, clearly the leader, was pointing, issuing orders. The fourth was his security. They were arrogant in their positioning, focused entirely on the destruction of the convoy and the suppression of the FOB. They had no idea she was there. Sharma slowly unslung the M110. She silently chambered around. She settled the rifle, but into the pocket of her shoulder, her cheek finding its familiar place on the stock. She exhaled, her body becoming as still as the rock she was lying on. Her crosshairs settled on the man with the binoculars. He was the spotter, the eyes of the enemy. Without him, the mortars would fall silent. She let out half a breath and held it. The world narrowed to the space inside her scope. Her finger tightened on the trigger. ####6. The shift in the storm. Inside the Tactical Operations Center, the atmosphere was thick with desperation. Colonel Madsen stood before the main drone feed, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the console. The thermal image showed the trapped convoy being systematically dismantled. The radio was a chaotic flood of dying men's pleas and the roar of static. The QRF was still pinned. They were losing. "Where is that mortar fire coming from?" he snarled at a harried-looking intelligence officer. "Give me a target package now." "We can't get a drone close enough, sir. They've got heavy machine guns covering the airspace over the ridge." Master Sergeant Thorne stood near the radio, his face a grim mask. He was listening to the rhythms of the battle, and he knew they had, at best, minutes before the convoy was completely overrun. The battle had a momentum, a terrible downhill slide into catastrophe. And then a new sound cut through the din. It was utterly distinct from the chaotic hammering of the machine guns and the staccato bark of the AK-47s. It was a single sharp, heavy crack. On the drone feed, a thermal signature on the small, northern outcrop simply vanished. One of the figures just dropped. Madsen stared, confused. What was that? Before anyone could answer, the sound came again. Crack. A second figure on the outcrop, one holding a long object, an RPG, aimed at the convoy, staggered and fell. The rocket flew wild, exploding harmlessly against the hillside. A stunned silence fell over the TOC. All eyes were fixed on the screen. The shots were not coming from the FOB. They weren't coming from the convoy. They were coming from an impossible angle, from a position no friendly forces occupied. "Who the hell is firing?" Madsen demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. He keyed his command channel. "All scimitar elements. I have unidentified friendly fire from the northern outcrop. Who is at that position? Acknowledge." The only reply was static. Crack. The third shot. This one took down the man with the radio, silencing the enemy's primary communication link. The effect was immediate and profound. The disciplined, suppressive mortar fire, which had been so devastatingly effective, abruptly ceased. The rain of explosives stopped as if a switch had been thrown. On the ground, PFC Evans was huddled behind the useless bulk of a disabled Humvee tire, his rifle pressed to his shoulder, trying to return fire at ghosts on the ridge. The sudden silence of the mortars was more shocking than their explosions. He looked up confused. He saw an RPG gunner on the ridge stand up to get a clear shot, and then, as if swatted by an invisible hand, the man's helmet flew off and he crumpled to the ground. Evans followed the imaginary line of the shot back, not to the FOB, but to the small, insignificant cluster of rocks to the north. Who was up there? The shift in the battle was palpable. The enemy fighters, their leaders suddenly and violently eliminated and their mortar support gone, began to lose their cohesion. Their rate of fire slackened. They were confused, looking for the source of the deadly, accurate shots that were plucking their men from the ridge line one by one. The unseen sniper was not just killing them. They were deconstructing their attack, dismantling their command structure with surgical precision. Crack. An enemy machine gunner slumped over his weapon. Crack. A squad leader fell as he tried to rally his men. In the TOC, Madsen and Thorne watched, utterly transfixed. They were witnessing a masterclass in marksmanship. The shots were perfectly placed, prioritizing high-value targets. The firing was methodical, unhurried, and absolutely lethal. The downhill slide of the battle had not just stopped. It had been arrested and was beginning to reverse. "It's one shooter," Thorne said, his voice laced with awe. "Just one." Madsen stared at the screen, at the ghost on the outcrop who was single-handedly turning the tide. The question no longer felt angry, but desperate. "Who are you?" he whispered to the screen. ####7. The second test, a hunted ghost. The enemy, though bloodied and confused, were not fools. They were seasoned fighters, and they adapted quickly. The initial shock of losing their command element gave way to a focused, vengeful rage. They realized the devastating fire was coming from a single, isolated position. The hunter was about to become the hunted. On the drone feed in the TOC, Madsen watched in horror as a dozen enemy fighters broke off from the main assault on the convoy and began a flanking maneuver, charging toward the rocky outcrop. They were moving fast, using the terrain for cover, bounding from rock to rock in a clear attempt to swarm and overwhelm the lone sniper. "Damn it," Madsen spat. "She's drawn their full attention. They're going to overrun her." The QRF was finally able to move now that the mortars had stopped, but they were still too far away. The trapped convoy was in no position to provide support. The sniper was completely alone, about to be engulfed. "Get the QRF moving to support that position. Now," Madsen ordered, knowing it was probably too late. From her perch, Sergeant Sharma saw them coming. She had known they would. An effective sniper inevitably becomes the priority target. This was the second test, the price of her intervention. She showed no fear, only a cold, professional assessment of the new threat. She had already prepared for it. Before the flanking maneuver even began, she had identified secondary and tertiary firing positions on the small, rocky plateau. She had her magazines laid out, her fields of fire mapped in her mind. She fired her last shot from her initial position, dropping the lead fighter in the flanking team, then immediately scuttled backward like a crab, pulling her rifle with her. She didn't stand up. She stayed low, using a shallow channel in the rock to move to her second position, 10 meters to her left. The enemy, expecting her to still be in her original spot, saturated it with automatic fire. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks where her head had been seconds before. From her new position, she had a different angle. She rose up just enough to sight her rifle, fired 2 quick, precise shots, and dropped 2 more fighters who had been focused on her previous nest. Crack, crack. Then she moved again. It became a deadly shell game. She was a phantom, never where they expected her to be. She used the geometry of the battlefield against them, firing a shot from one spot, then using their suppressive fire as cover to relocate to another. To the enemy fighters on the ground, it sounded like they were facing not one sniper, but 3 or 4, a coordinated team of ghosts picking them apart from the rocks. Their confident assault faltered, turning into a hesitant, fearful advance. They were being psychologically dismantled as much as physically. In the TOC, Madsen and Thorne watched the drone feed, their disbelief warring with awe. "She's playing with them," Thorne breathed. "She's using their own flanking maneuver to draw them into a kill zone." Madsen could only nod, speechless. This wasn't just good shooting. This was tactical brilliance of the highest order. This was an operator who had spent a lifetime turning ambushes inside out. She was predicting the enemy's movements, anticipating their lines of attack, and meeting them with lethal precision at every turn. The flanking force was broken. With more than half their number down, the remaining fighters lost their nerve. They turned and fled, dragging their wounded with them. Their retreat signaled the end of the entire ambush. The remaining fighters on the main ridge, seeing their elite element routed, began to melt away into the hills. The attack had collapsed. The QRF finally reached the convoy, securing the survivors and establishing a perimeter. The battle was over. On the drone feed, the single, tiny thermal signature on the outcrop disappeared from view. The ghost had vanished. Sharma was already on her way back to the base, her rifle cooling against her back, leaving nothing behind but spent brass and dead enemies. ####8. The name in the shadows. Nix. Sergeant Sharma slipped back through the maintenance hatch as silently as she had left. She moved through the now quieting base, a shadow in the harsh afternoon sun. The adrenaline was gone, replaced by a low, humming calm. She went directly to the armory, cleaned the M110 with a practiced, almost meditative precision until it looked as if it had never been fired, and returned it to its case. The young armorer was too busy listening to the excited chatter about the ghost sniper to notice a return. She walked back to the supply depot, picked up her clipboard, and resumed her inventory count as if she had never left. But the base was a tinderbox of rumor and speculation. The rescued convoy soldiers were telling wild stories of an angel of Kandahar, a single sniper who had single-handedly broken the ambush. No one knew who it was. The mystery only fueled the legend. Colonel Madsen, however, was not interested in legends. He wanted answers. He strode into the supply depot, his face a thundercloud, with Master Sergeant Thorne trailing behind him. He found Sharma checking the expiration dates on crates of medical supplies. "Sergeant," Madsen's voice was a low growl that cut through the quiet tent. "Where were you during the attack?" Sharma turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Here, sir." Securing the depot, her answer was calm, plausible, and a complete lie. Madsen's eyes narrowed. He was a man used to command, to having his orders obeyed and his questions answered. Her placid defiance was infuriating. "Don't lie to me, Sergeant. I had a drone watching that outcrop. A single operator saved an entire convoy and stopped this base from being overrun. And that operator disappeared right before you reappeared. Now, for the last time, I want to know who you are." Before Sharma could answer, Thorne stepped forward. He held a secure network tablet in his hand, its screen glowing. His face was pale, his expression one of profound shock. "Sir," Thorne said, his voice barely a whisper. He held the tablet out for the colonel to see. "I couldn't let it go. I called in a favor with a friend at SOCOM, asked him to run her service number through a different system. A deeper 1-inch. Madsen took the tablet. On the screen was Sharma's file, but this one was not redacted. It was filled with commendations so numerous and classified they were identified only by operation code names. It listed skills: high-altitude low opening, halo, parachute jumps, advanced demolitions, multiple languages, tier 1 marksmanship qualifications that Madsen didn't even know existed. Her previous unit was listed simply as Special Activities Division. And at the top, next to her name, was a call sign. Nix. The name struck Colonel Madsen like a physical blow. He staggered back a step, the tablet clutched in his hand. Nix. It wasn't just a name. It was a ghost story, a legend whispered in classified briefings and intelligence circles. Nix was a phantom operator, part of a deeply classified special missions unit known as Project Chimera, credited with dozens of missions deemed impossible. Deep cover assassinations, hostage rescues from impenetrable fortresses, counter-terror operations so sensitive they were never acknowledged. The official story was that Nix had been killed in action during an operation in Syria 2 years ago. The entire unit was supposedly disbanded. He looked up from the screen, his slate-gray eyes locking with Sharma's. He wasn't seeing a quiet logistics sergeant anymore. He wasn't seeing dead weight. He was seeing a living legend, a tier 1 operator hiding in plain sight for reasons he couldn't possibly comprehend. She hadn't lied to him. She had been securing the depot, and the convoy, and the entire damn base. "My God," Madsen breathed, the sound swallowed by the vast, silent tent. The whispers about dead weight felt like a blasphemy now. They hadn't been assigned a liability. They had been sent a guardian angel, and they had been too blind to see it. ####9. A salute in the dust. The next morning, the sun rose on a different FOB sentinel. The physical base was the same, but its social geography had been irrevocably altered. The story had spread like wildfire, passed in hushed, awestruck tones through the barracks and the mess hall. Thorne's discreet inquiries had unearthed a legend, and now everyone knew. The quiet logistics sergeant, the woman they had dismissed and nicknamed Deadweight, was Nix. As Anya Sharma walked from her bunk toward the supply depot to begin her duties, a silence fell over the usually boisterous morning crowd. The jeers and whispers were gone, replaced by something heavier, something akin to reverence. Men stopped what they were doing, cleaning rifles, loading vehicles, drinking coffee, and just watched her pass. Their eyes, which had once held scorn and pity, now reflected a mixture of fear, shame, and profound respect. PFC Evans stood with his squad near the main thoroughfare. He had seen the aftermath of the ambush up close. He had seen the bodies of the men who would be dead if not for the ghost on the rocks. He felt a hot flush of shame for his earlier comments, for his easy, ignorant judgment. As Sharma drew near, walking with that same steady, unassuming gait, Evans straightened his shoulders. Acting on an impulse that felt more right than any order he had ever followed, he snapped to attention and rendered a crisp, perfect salute. It was a breach of protocol. One doesn't typically salute a non-commissioned officer in the field unless reporting. But this was not about protocol. It was an act of fealty, an apology, a thank you. Sharma paused for a fraction of a second. She met his eyes, and for the first time, Evans saw something other than placid neutrality there. It was a flicker of understanding. She gave him a tiny, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement, and then continued on her way. But Evans' gesture had broken the dam. As Sharma passed, his squad mate, Diaz, also snapped to attention and saluted. Then another soldier across the way. The gesture rippled outward through the crowd, a wave of silent, public recognition. It was a spontaneous, uncommanded tribute from the grunts, the men on the ground, the very people she had saved. They weren't saluting Sergeant Sharma of the logistics depot. They were saluting Nix. They were saluting a warrior. From a second-story veranda of the TOC, Colonel Madsen watched the scene unfold. He had not slept. He had spent the night reading the unredacted portions of her file that Thorne had managed to access, and each page had only deepened his shame and his awe. He had been given one of the most elite soldiers on the planet, and he had sent her to count spare parts. He had called her deadweight. He stepped out into the morning light just as Sharma was passing below. The salutes from the soldiers continued, a silent, rolling honor guard. Madsen stood straight, his own posture rigid and formal. He did not salute. A colonel does not salute a sergeant. But he met her gaze across the dusty yard. As she looked up, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a simple gesture, but it was freighted with meaning. It was a full and unconditional surrender of his previous judgment. It was the quiet, profound apology of a commander who knows he was wrong. It was the ultimate sign of respect. ####10. The weight of name. The sun bled across the horizon, painting the jagged peaks of the Hindu Kush in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange. The oppressive heat of the day finally began to recede, replaced by the cool, thin air of the desert night. At the western perimeter, Sergeant Anya Sharma stood alone, leaning against the HESCO barriers. The base behind her was settling into its nighttime rhythm, but she faced outward toward the vast, hostile emptiness. She was no longer counting inventory. Her assignment had become a quiet, unofficial post, Overwatch. No one had ordered it. It was simply understood. Where she went, safety followed. The soldiers in the guard towers tracked her position with binoculars, not out of suspicion, but for reassurance. The ghost was watching over them. She wasn't holding a rifle. Her hands were empty, resting on the rough canvas of the barrier. Her posture, for the first time since her arrival, seemed to hold a measure of peace. The weight she carried was not the judgment of these soldiers that had been lifted. The weight was the name they now whispered with such awe. Nix. It was a name forged in shadow and violence, a name she had tried to bury under manifests and inventory logs. She had come to FOB Sentinel seeking anonymity, a quiet place to let the ghosts of her past settle. But the past she knew had a long reach. Footsteps crunched softly on the gravel behind her. She didn't turn. She had already identified the tread pattern, the weight of the steps. It was PFC Evans. The young soldier stopped a respectful few feet away. He held out a battered metal canteen. Figured you might be thirsty, Sergeant, he said, his voice quiet, devoid of its earlier cockiness. He didn't use her call sign. He used her rank. It was a small but significant gesture of understanding. He was acknowledging the soldier, not just the legend. Sharma turned her head slightly and looked at him. Her eyes, which had seemed so hard and distant before, now held a faint warmth in the fading light. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of her lips. She reached out and took the canteen. "Thank you, Private," she said. The exchange was simple. A shared drink of water at the edge of the world. But it was everything. It was acceptance. It was a bridge built between the myth and the woman, between the legend and the rookie who was just trying to survive his first tour. She took a slow sip, the cool water a balm in the dry air. Evan stood beside her, not speaking, just sharing the silence. They stood together, two soldiers silhouetted against the dying light, watching the first stars begin to appear in the vast, darkening sky. The whispers were gone, replaced by a quiet, earned respect that was as solid and enduring as the mountains that stood guard around them. Anya Sharma was no longer dead weight. She was the sentinel,